Hello,
Здравствуйте.
I'm Karina Sheifer. I'm working at the Institute of Linguistics of Russian Academy of Science. I'm working at the Lab of Small Languages Research and Preservation. Olga is my colleague, is also from the Institute of Linguistics of Russian Academy of Science. Hello, I'm Olga Pavlova. I'm working at the Research Center of Russia's Languages Preservation, Restoration, and Documentation at the Institute of Linguistics of the Russian Academy of Science. We are young linguists. We are doing the field linguistics because linguistics is pretty wide discipline. It has a lot of approaches. There are those researchers who are doing only the table work or desktop work, and there are those who are working with the dead language, and we are dealing with those languages which are almost dead. Unfortunately, these languages are languages of Russia, and many of them are not really well preserved. That's why we do work in the field, in small villages, where also small folks are living. And this situation is something what we do really care about. We do our linguistic works, we also research the grammar, we also search for lacunas in the grammar. We also do the language activism, which is one of our areas of activity, because we don't really want to be silent watching what is happening to our subject of research, because it is of our professional interest as well. And these languages are also well connected to the people who speak these languages. That's why we really want to help them to preserve these languages. And also, I'd like to tell you that the language activism is not only about the linguist. I think it is also a kind of exclusion, because the language activism is a very open area, a very open movement, and the representatives of the spokes really support and do this thing. I can only support you here because we also get very interesting projects, because we also get the support from these language communities. Because the language activism is something what we can really identify as the initiative from the bottom. Sometimes this language activism is also supported by the state, or by grants, or by private companies, but usually it is based on people's enthusiasm, and these people usually have a very close circle of cooperation. Everyone knows everyone pretty well. We also meet each other at different language festivals. Some people can also organize language camps. We have a lot of these initiatives in Russia. This is an initiative from the bottom, and it has also a lot of advantages, because people are really well motivated. They have an internal fire because they really want to preserve their languages. It is really cool. On the other hand, when people have to earn money during the biggest part of the day, that's why they don't have sometimes not enough more time and efforts in order to be active in the language field. This is a kind of a complication for many language activists, because they had to distribute their energy, their resources, of their time in order to be able to earn money. Many people really accept this kind of requirement in order to have a kind of practice, in order to keep or preserve their language when there is a significant language shift which comes up in their community, when it is not more possible actually to give the language to the next generation, when they don't have any elders, any chiefs, in order to get this most competent knowledge, because these elders and chiefs are usually have the best knowledge of these small languages. And sometimes these language activists, they also would like to give this language to their children, and sometimes these language activists don't even speak this language as the language they really got in their families. Some of these activists manage to learn this language, and they create a kind of language environment for their children. As for the language environment, we understand here a kind of environment where there is a language. Here we can really talk about visual filling of our environment, our space with this language. Examples, it could be also an audio filling, it could be also songs, it could be also announcements in transportation, it could be also advertising in TV or radio. When the language is in our environment, it certainly also contributes to better prestige of this language, and it also contributes to the fact that the language can really remind about itself. So in this case, we cannot really forget about it, because I think it is not a medicine which can really help to save and preserve the language, but I think it is quite an important element in order to keep and develop the language. And sometimes a minority language is not really popular. It is a matter of fact, and is a big problem, because in this case the main focus is on the official language only, and it usually is reflected at school when students prefer to choose Russians, and also the teachers will prefer to choose Russians, because in here this case they have actually more lessons in order to get well prepared for the national state exam. Because if you talk about the first language, and if you don't really speak your first language, it is, I think, something what is quite often seen among the Russian minority folks. And if we do actually the people count, sometimes we get this answer: what is your first language, what kind of language you speak? And the answers are sometimes even different. We also do the social linguistic polls, and when we ask what is actually your nationality, and the answer is I'm an evank, and then I ask what is your first language? Certainly evanki, because I'm an evank. Do you speak evanki? No, I don't speak evanki. And the first language is something on this occasion that people can really remember and say, we have our own first language and we can speak and we can use it on these occasions. And this is also a matter of a case in many language communities, and the language activists, they use this language not on these festive occasions. I also would like to comment on your idea that the attitude towards the first language to something what is a very sensitive one can be a bit confusing for many of us, because we know many cases when the people's account showed that people actually indicated any language as their first language, even if there are 200 or 300 people who can really speak this language, but linguists usually know that there are probably only dozens competent native speakers of this language. And I think it is quite an interesting thing which can really keep us pretty away from the reality. And if we take into account the fact, if we talk about Russian languages, the competent native speakers are usually people of all the generations, and it's not a top secret for anyone, and young people and children usually speak these languages pretty seldom, and it can really keep us in a quite wrong view, even if we have 200 or 300 speakers of this language. And I think it is not the start of the end, it's pretty close to real end. And the last native speakers are usually elder people, and the language activists are usually young people, and it's actually a kind of new generation of these speakers, because these young activists can really be those ones who can really save these dying out languages. What are the practices used by language activists? Because the life of every single language is certainly connected with the human life, with the community life, and every actions which can be done by the language activist, they will certainly be linked to a certain social events. The most obvious one is actually how to learn a language. And if we talk about adults, these have one type of practice, and we talk about children, it's another type of practices. And I think it's quite a global topic, and we need to give it quite a significant attention to it. We can also start with the adults, because many Russian communities have their own language courses, usually at libraries, and these courses are also supported by volunteers. These volunteers are usually those who can really speak these languages at a certain level, at least at a certain level, in order to be able to bring over the grammar or words to the other people, because it is also good. It could be really quite important for many language communities if someone of you thinks he doesn't know any language pretty well. You can also look around and you can also find out that there is no one who can even know this language better than you. And if you have any inner motivation, you can also become a kind of also a conductor for many people to the world of this language. The courses are only one history, and with the pandemic we all started living online, and we also have some online courses for different languages. We also have courses for Korean languages and for different dialects of the Korean. As for the other practices, I'm certainly really like the method when there is a master and there is a student. There is a learning pair. In this pair, there is a master who knows pretty well language. You also were able actually to work with such a pair. Please tell us more about it. I will certainly tell you more about it. There is a competent master and there is a student who would like also to learn this language, and Karina and me, were taking part in a joint project of our institute along with the Center of Arctic Initiatives in order to make this master-student method more popular. And I was working with one pair, and Karina was working with two other language pairs, including the Evenki, and our colleague Marina was working with the Hanti language. And the sense of this method is master teaches the student the language during a joint activity, so we don't need any textbooks, any grammar books here, any vocabularies here. Sometimes a student can come to the master, or some our pairs or having classes also somewhere at the river or in the forest, and this pair can also do any activity. This activity can be really a very traditional one. They can also cook, they can also sit at a table, they can also be knitting, do everything they want. However, the main rule is the whole communication is in this target language only. The master takes into account the level of a student, and students shouldn't also lose the motivation, and the student should also be able to dive into a language. And this process is also not very simple, because we also were observing that the students were having it pretty complicated during the first lessons, because people were getting pretty tired even during the first hour of these first classes. Then the people can really started getting more grammar, more words, and they actually were able to understand the languages, and they also found it easy to communicate in this language with the masters. And if we use this master-student method, I think the learning process is pretty complicated, because it's quite difficult to think through such a practice, which should really actually could motivate to communicate in his language, because there are not enough such actions. For example, you can also cook fish, or you can also repair something, but if you really try to do something in your practice, to do any activity, you will also certainly feel that it is much easier to use the majority language, to use the title language of your nation. So you will be always be willing here in Russia to switch to Russian. It will be very difficult, and everything depends on people's enthusiasm. And those who are working in this form, they are a language activist, and the fact that they really want to be with this practice, this is their step to be within this language activism, no matter whether it is the master who is trying to give his or her native language to a student, or if it is whether it is the student, because the student is undertaking such a significant action for his or her nation and folk. As for the courses, I also would like to describe this situation, because the situation is really different for different languages. The Russians sometimes are also aware that we have also many nations and nationalities and folks in our country, and some people also think that there are many languages, and these languages can also live their own lives, and these lives are pretty well. And many linguists think that in Caucasian we have lots of languages, and they all are well preserved. However, we are currently observing the significant language shift. We now got a new generation of people who don't really speak their native languages, their first languages. And sometimes when the people really leave the villages and move to the cities, you also usually change your language, because in the village you can also speak your first language. You can also be in your native language environment. And in the cities, people have to undertake efforts in order to keep their first language. And if we talk about those areas where the folks are living in a very really dense situation, but I think this situation comes up pretty seldom. Usually, these languages have a kind of republican status, like Tatar or Chuvasha or Udmurtian. But unfortunately, we also started having the first generation of children who don't speak their native or first languages. That's why now we got this actual direction of language activism. And we also have some additional practices who can really help us here. I agree with you. I can only add to what you said, and I would like to add one interesting thing, because when during our field work we talk to the native speakers, we usually ask, what can we do, or what can you do in order to preserve the language? The first answer is actually to start having this language at school. But nevertheless, if the language is in the education system, it is extremely important. And the fact that we now are having less classes for the small languages at school, it is a significant hit against the small languages, because many parents started choosing the Russian language due to the reason that the national state exam should be passed in Russian. That's why the Russian classes are also accepted by students and their elders as a good preparation for this national state exam. That's why we shouldn't blame the parents for choosing not their native language, and because so many of them really wish all the best to their children. Nevertheless, we need to really to change our view how to teach native languages at school, because those children who come to school, they usually have these languages at the first ones, because sometimes they may also speak and they may not really speak these languages. That's why the teaching methods for these small languages should be pretty similar to the language teaching methods when you start learning a language from the scratch. And now we can really come over to the content, because you mentioned also Caucasian languages or languages of Dagestan, because these languages started showing a pretty negative trend within the last 5 years, when the children, even in villages, are not able to speak their first native languages in comparison to the previous generation. And here, many language community members really point out the role of cartoons, smartphones, apps, how they really affect the language skills. And this actually, the children content in these small languages can be really distributed pretty widely. It can be really important because it will be helping to preserve this language in children's minds, and it is really worth doing, and many language activists know it pretty well and understand this fact, and they really start to undertake efforts in order to create this kind of content for children. Unfortunately, we are not really able to say that we have a lot of this kind of contact for a particular language. And we also have many small languages in Russia, when we started to see first signs of it, and it is really good. If we talk about the content for children, we talk about cartoons and movies for them, and that's why we also need to take into account the mechanisms of children, how the children really accept a language being in a mono language environment. And certainly when the children can watch this kind of cartoons and movies in a young age, it will certainly create certain basics of this native language. But even if a 6-year-old boy is gonna watch this kind of cartoon in this small language, he won't really understand it, because you can really make this kind of experiment on yourself. You can only start watching a movie in Finnish or Swedish, and this is not the way for you how to learn this language, because the content should be not only translated cartoons, but this should be cartoons created especially, specifically in a small language. For example, there is a character Dasha, which is actually discovers many things in the world, but in this case, the child watching this kind of cartoon can really use the language used in this cartoon. But in this case, we also need also a very strong IT team, the strong linguist who can really create this kind of content. And I'm absolutely sure we don't have any teaching cartoons in small Russia's languages. However, there is Tatar Cartoon Company, which creates cartoons in Tatar, or it also, this studio creates also cartoons in other small languages of Tatarstan, like Marshali. But I think it is quite impossible actually to be even more visible in the background of the Russian or English cartoons and movies. I absolutely agree with you. I think this should be also a political will. I think the problem is pretty comprehensive in this case. It is also important to pay attention to the family role here. I don't really know anything about any activist projects related with the support of the multi-language communication in families, but if the parents use in their dialogues the Russian language in order the child gets a better Russian knowledge, I think that's a big problem, because the parents should really get it right, that one more language, one more ethnical native language is a big value. They should understand it, and it is quite important to understand that this native language is a value. And I hope those who can listening to us right now should understand it, because I really communicate with many minority folks of Russia, especially in Siberia, in the Russian Far East. I talked to Karakin, and I talked to an Evank lady yesterday, and I also talked about the children education and growing up. In this case, these were children, and in the other case, these were the grandchildren. Both these ladies from these two different folks said that they stopped efforts giving over their native language to their children when they faced and the children started actually mixing up the language codes, and this was pretty frightening situation for the children, that they were afraid that children were not really able to get both languages right. And I think in this period of time is gonna be kind of revolutionary one, or could be, and that's why the parents stop giving over their native language, stop giving over their native language to their children. And sometimes the parents also bring their children to Russian-speaking kindergarten. And sometimes when the parents keep speaking Russian at home, and sometimes in the kindergarten, children speak Russian only. And there are in some of the Russian regions where there are native language kindergartens. For example, in the northern Alsatia, there is a polylingual educational method. One educator speaks Russian, another educator speaks a local language to the children, because there are many Alsatian speaking people there. That's why this system allows to bring those children who speak Russian, and they can also learn Alsatian, and they are also the Alsatian speaking children who can improve their Russian skills. And I think it's a kind of a movement in two directions. And I think it's quite important when there are these movements from both sides, and it can be a benefit for the children. And I don't really think that this is a language activism. I think it is probably a language activism of a larger scale. And I think just probably kind of private initiative. If we talk about the Northern Alsatia, I know the children club which is currently introducing the Alsatian language to these children. When we're talking about two initiatives there, I think that's quite a rare case. Even if you need to find an example, you need also to search the Russian regions, because we also had examples that Russian regions also have their local languages as the title languages, like Udmurtian or any other languages. And these Republican regions have their own kindergartens where the children use their local languages. And Yakutia is a very good example for many other regions and people, because there are only 500,000 Yakuts there. If we look at the statistics, so the number of Yakutian native speakers and the number of Yakuts is equal. However, there are also many Yakuts who are not speaking Yakutian. We also really talk about other folks in Yakutia like Evanks, who also started using Yakutian instead of their local and first languages. And nevertheless, I think it's quite a significant success in our multinational country, and we can really talk there about kindergartens where children can fully and only speak Yakutian. But unfortunately, this kind of situation is not in every single Russian region. Quite often, we can certainly talk about a language as the national component for children education at kindergartens, at children care centers, and probably there is such a requirement at the regional level for kindergartens of children care centers. I think this example can be found not only in the national republics. For example, in the Tver region, there are many also Karelians. These people used to live there, or people who really were able to call there as Karelians. Now, for the people's count shows that we don't have many Karelians in the Tver regions. but we still have some of them there, and there are huge kindergartens there where having twice a week classes for Karelian topic. They can also make theater performance in Karelian with very simple phrases and wordings. I'm not absolutely sure that the children can really learn a language through this kind of theater performances, but I'm absolutely sure they are really getting familiar with the languages. And during the fasting time, the Meksatiha village has a festival, which is called not the Goodbye Winter Festival, but this village also usually makes lots of pancakes, and they also use this pancake tradition in these classes. They also use the Karelian wordings for that, and I think this is quite an interesting work, and this is only possible when there is a goodwill and when there are efforts of this kindergarten manager, and I can really call this manager a language activist. I can only also use 2 moments out of what you said. First of all, that's a theater performance in a local language. We also have examples from Buryatia. We had also there and Ninakan contest. Ninakan is an Vang fairy tale, and the Evanks are people living in 9 Russian regions in Siberia, in the Russian Far East. Usually, we have many Evanks in Khabarovsk, in Yakutia, and Krasnoyarsk, and these Evanks come to Buryatia, and they also do their theater performance in Evenki, and there is this contest where they can really win. And there is another moment which Olga mentioned. You can also get familiar with the language, because this kind of theater performances do not lead to the fact that can you really get any basic language knowledge. But as for the familiarization with the language, many people who do not know this kind of language, they can really get familiar with the language, because there are people who really had a good contact with the local or first language, and those who didn't have this contact with the first language. I also have a set of stable games with one of my colleague, and we also made these table games in more than 10 languages, usually for the folks in the Russian Siberia, in the Russian Far East. And this is a quite conventional table games where you can play and speak Evenki or Evenki or Karelian or any other language, or Dolgani or Sami. Certainly, I also try to use all these table games to the schools, kindergartens, to ethnical centers in different cities and villages, and I also work with the teachers and educators there, because sometimes people who work even in this small language, they don't even speak their local language, their first languages. I used to work in Khabarovsk, in one of the small villages, and one of the educators in the kindergartens was a passive native speaker, and she was actually pretty active during the game. She was really able to understand everything what is said in the local language in this game, because we also have some structures for the phrases which you can use in order to build up sentences if you don't speak this language, and there were also some cards in order to sum up the points in order to identify the winner in the game. And when we were playing this game, this lady was sitting in a corner mixing up these cards with the figures, and she said, I was speaking Evenki with my grandfather, and I didn't even thought that we had our own figures. She used to live in a settlement where everybody used to speak Evenki, when she thought that only Russian language had the figures and the Evenki didn't have any figures at all, but it was not true. And it is quite often with these small folk languages, because usually these languages stopped at their development. We are linguists, and for example, if we take Finnish, which is actually an official language of Finland, and there is also the Hanti language, which is one of the Ural languages. And the Hanti language stopped developing and stopped enriching its vocabulary because all the innovative processes were going further in Russian, not in this language. And if this language development had continued, we could have now more developed languages. If we look now currently at the Evenki vocabulary, it has 25,000 words. It is not 5,000 words. It is quite a significant language fundament, and these languages I shouldn't be really underestimate, and sometimes these languages are morphologically even much more developed than the Russian language, because the Evenki language has also 12 types of verbs, and the same is in Russian, has only 2 types of verbs. And these languages will also have different verbs showing a certain action. You can also laugh with a stick or laugh with a stone, and the Evenki has 2 different verbs for these 2 loving actions. But due to the language policy of the Soviet Union, now we also have these processes which are currently killing these languages, and the language activists are currently trying to reverse this situation, this trend. I also agree with you because you mentioned the vocabularies. However, I would like to point out another thing. It is important to have the versions of these vocabularies, because these 25,000 words for Evenki or 18,000 words for Tver Karelian language, it is quite a significant amount of words, and we do really understand right now because people started losing their traditional handcrafts and history and culture. That's why they lose the words they used to use in the past to describe the activities. That's why the small languages become simplified, and we know that the people started saying figures in Russian instead of their local languages. That is quite a normal trend. And if we can really have the electronic versions of this vocabulary, would be good support in this case, because we don't really have enough freshly printed vocabularies of small languages. It's quite difficult to find them in libraries or in stores, and if there is an electronic vocabulary somewhere in the web, it will be a kind of help which can really lead them back to the language. That's why I would like to underline the importance of work done by those who are dealing with this kind of story. I also know a lot of examples out of the Tver linked to the Tver Karelian language, because I used to work there. I also know that these guys spent several years in order to digitalize the printed vocabulary out of 1960s. And now this vocabulary is in a digital format. It is really available for many people, and it is also a kind of content when there is a electronic or digital vocabulary. This vocabulary can has not only words but also a lot of ethnographical materials, descriptions of some household things and so on. I think it is quite a useful and interesting tool. And if we really come over to the IT products, I have to say right now that languages which are really considered to be as dying ones, as small ones, they are not really represented in social media or somewhere in the web. And if we really manage to create any language environment, any language field for this kind of languages, it will be a significant step forward. This is actually about the written blogs. However, I have to say, if this language is a small one and there are few people speaking this language, only elder people who do not really access to the internet because they are actually not digitally advanced or they are just pretty old. And probably these blogs don't have enough readers. And in order not to lose any audience, these language enthusiasts start using Russian and create the ethnographic content. I'll do also the same. For example, I have also a Tungursky blog. I also tried to write the Evenki language, but there is no one who can really read these posts. And I do write also the Evenki with the Russian words, but it's not really the best language practice. Did you try to do the doubling when you have also the Russian and the Evenki text? I used to write in Evenki text and the Russian text underneath, but usually people really skip the Evenki part, and it's quite, sometimes they also compare the Russian text with the Evenki text, and probably our current time is a very fast time, and the people used to do it really fast. And sometimes when people live in a village next to the people who speak Evenki, it is not a value for them. And also we have a situation with some of the small languages when there is only one native speaker left. And I had to tell you one thing: if there is only one native speaker left, we need to do something in order to preserve the language. Sometimes these small communities begin actually to rethink the situation with the language, because after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, they wanted actually to find their own identities, and when they really identified this national identity, they started actually thinking about their local language. It is quite easy to recognize that you are a Yokagir, but to start learning or speaking Yokagir, this is much more complicated. And I think we talk here about the different practices, and sometimes we all can only sadly sad that these practices don't get any positive development. They have to be really objective here. What do you say? It is a good thing. We can certainly be somewhere in the sky. They can really fall down to the earth and won't be able to get up again, because everything is not so simple. This example which you brought, when the language dies out with having only one native speaker left. Karelian used to be the native language of my grandmother and she used to speak this Karelian until she died, and she had also a significant accent even in Russia. I do remember this Karelian accent in Russia. And if I talk about the relatives of my mother, they all understand Karelian, but they don't speak Karelian. But in my generation, there is no one who can even understand this Karelian. Probably a couple of people can really know a couple of words of Karelian, no more. And the idea is that the Karelian language should be in my life. This is something what I have been dreaming of and doing my whole life. And when I didn't have any course of Karelian in Tver, I started learning Finnish. I really wanted to be even closer to Karelian because Karelian is really pretty close to Finnish. I used to do it for a while, and last year I started thinking about this station. I used to work in this community. I actually partially Karelian, and I really heard this language from my childhood. I really wanted to know this culture, and this culture is really pretty well directed to the language, and the Russian culture doesn't have any elements of the Karelian culture at all. And I also think it is something what really builds up my own identity as a person. I started attending online courses. I started communicating with some people and doing our everyday life. When I had my work, my family, I had to find time for non-European, non-Asian language which has a significant bright future. It was quite difficult, and I do really understand, despite the fact that I'm a linguist, that I won't be certainly widely communicating in Karelian. However, I do have quite a significant inner motivation, but it also requires for me significant resources. But what? I have to understand that it is going to be so, but I shouldn't also give up. I should keep going this way. In reality, the further life of a language and a language community depends on the decision of every single language community member. I agree with you.